New York. The rooftop of the Alderton Hotel. An October night. Garrett and I are having a baby together. Sloane looked straight into Catherine's eyes, cold smile. Voice soft as a breeze. Catherine froze. 33 weeks pregnant. Behind her, the entire city glittered. In front of her stood the woman who had sat in her meetings, eaten at her table, smiled at her for 2 years. "You need to walk away from me right now," she said, her voice steady. Sloane curved her lips. "Or what, Catherine?" Then 2 hands placed on her shoulders. Not a violent shove. Just pressure. Slow. Deliberate. From someone who had been planning this for a very long time. The city spun below. Catherine fell. But this is not the story of a woman who was pushed. This is the story of a woman who got back up and made everyone pay the price. Stay with us now, because you cannot afford to miss a single detail. Most women who survive a 3-story fall do not remember hitting the ground. Catherine remembered everything. The hands on her shoulders, the city lights spinning below her. The moment she understood with absolute clarity that the person who had pushed her was someone she had trusted completely. Someone who had sat at her dining room table and eaten her food and smiled at her across conference rooms for 2 years. But here is the thing no one tells you about surviving the unsurvivable. The fall was not the worst part. What her husband did after she survived that is what almost killed her. This is a story about a woman who lost everything that could be taken and discovered that the most important things could not be. It is a story about gaslighting so precise it nearly rewrote a woman's reality. And it is a story about what happens when someone who has spent years performing helplessness remembers that she was never actually helpless at all. If any part of what you are about to hear sounds familiar, stay until the end, because the final twist will change how you see everything that came before it. Catherine Brennan had built what most women spend their entire lives trying to construct. A husband who coached Little League on Saturday mornings and brought her coffee in bed on Sundays. A nursery painted the color of sea glass. Assembled piece by piece over 3 weekends with a crib that had taken 4 hours and 1 significant argument to put together. And 8 months of pregnancy that finally, genuinely felt like everything she had ever wanted. She was 34 years old. She had spent 11 years as a vice president of marketing, launching campaigns in 32 markets, turning failing brands around in under 6 months, sitting across conference tables from corporate attorneys twice her age, and winning arguments she had been told she could not win. Then she had fallen in love with Garrett Brennan, and she had made choices she told herself were temporary. The problem with building a life that looks perfect from the outside is that you stop checking the foundation. On a Tuesday morning in October, Catherine sat in the examination room of her obstetrician, Dr. Sandra Marsh, and listened to Emily's heartbeat through the monitor. Strong, steady, a little percussion against the silence. Catherine said, "She sounds good." Dr. Marsh smiled at the chart and then said, almost too casually, "She does. Blood pressure is good on your end too." She paused in the way that doctors pause when they are deciding how much to say. "Garrett called again this week. About stress levels. He seems very involved." Catherine smiled. "That is just how he is. He worries." She did not hear the hesitation underneath Dr. Marsh's voice. She was not listening for it. This was the version of her life where everything was fine. That afternoon she came home to their colonial house in Westchester, the one with the 3-car garage and the maples turning gold along the driveway, and found Garrett's Tesla already there. He had come home early. Dinner was on the stove. Flowers sat on the granite counter, still wrapped in paper from the florist on Main Street. He came into the kitchen when he heard the door, placed one hand on her belly, and said, "How is our girl?" Catherine leaned into him, closed her eyes, then opened them, and for just 1 second, watching him stir pasta and pour the wine she was not allowed to have, she felt something she immediately dismissed, like watching a man perform the role of husband, like watching a stage set from the wings instead of the audience. She shook it off, went upstairs to change. Women's intuition is not magic. It is pattern recognition. And Catherine's pattern recognition had been slowly, deliberately switched off over 4 years of marriage. That is how it works. That is always how it works. 2 days later, on a Tuesday at 2:17 in the afternoon, Garrett forgot his phone. In 6 years of marriage, Garrett Brennan had never once left the house without his phone. So when it lit up on the granite counter while Catherine was unloading the dishwasher, she almost did not look. Almost. The screen showed a message from a contact saved as Sloane Marketing Consult. It said 4 words. Last night was everything. Catherine set the phone back down, carefully, exactly where it had been. She finished unloading the dishwasher. She wiped down the counter. She sat on a kitchen stool and breathed for 60 seconds and did not cry and did not scream and did not do any of the things she would later understand she was being counted on not to do. She thought one sentence, very clearly, in the part of her brain that had spent 11 years in corporate strategy. I need to know how bad this is before he knows that I know. That single decision, that one moment of stillness, was the reason she survived what came next. That night, after Garrett was asleep, she opened her laptop at the kitchen table with a glass of water and pulled up their joint bank account. 3 months of statements. She went through them methodically, the way she used to go through quarterly reports, looking for the pattern underneath the numbers. What she found made her stomach turn in a way that had nothing to do with pregnancy. A hotel charge. The Alderton in Manhattan. A Thursday night in August. Garrett had been in Philadelphia that Thursday. She had cooked dinner for herself and eaten it at this same table and watched a movie she could not now remember. A jewelry receipt, forwarded to an email address she had never seen. A ring, her size. Garrett's credit card. Catherine had never received a ring that year. Not for her birthday. Not for their anniversary. A restaurant reservation. Valentine's Day. Table for two at a place she had never been. That Valentine's Day. Garrett had a bored dinner. She had ordered Thai food and fallen asleep before 10. She did not cry that night. She made a spreadsheet, because that is what women do when they have spent 11 years in corporate America. They document before they confront. And what Catherine documented over the next 3 hours was the architecture of a lie 18 months in the making. Here is something important. If you are ever in a Catherine's position, and I genuinely hope you never are, the most critical thing is what she did in that moment. She did not confront him. Not that night. She copied every document. She forwarded the bank statements to a private email account he did not know existed. She photographed the phone screen before she set it back down. Evidence first, emotion second. That order matters enormously in a family court. They cannot subpoena feelings. They can subpoena documentation. Start a folder, a private one, on a device he cannot access. Keep it somewhere safe. Catherine kept hers on an old phone she had switched to a prepaid plan. Tucked inside the zippered pocket of the diaper bag she had already packed for the hospital. She spent 7 days building her case. She also spent 40 minutes in the office of a family law attorney named Barbara Foss, just an initial consultation, just to understand her options. Barbara had a way of explaining things without making them feel either simple or hopeless. 7 days later, Catherine was ready. What she did not know was how fast Garrett had been building his. She waited until after dinner on a Friday. Emily was kicking steadily, the way she did in the evenings, and Catherine sat across from Garrett at the kitchen table with a glass of water, and her hands very still in her lap, and said simply, "I know about Sloan." What she had expected was guilt, or anger, or the stumbling scramble of a man caught in a lie he had not finished telling. What she got instead told her everything. Garrett set down his coffee, exhaled slowly, and said with enormous patience, as if she were a child who had woken from a nightmare, "Cat, I have been so worried about you. Sandra mentioned you have been under extreme stress. She said it can affect perception. I did not want to alarm you, but I think you have been struggling more than you have let on." He did not deny it. He did not explain it. He redirected it. Back onto her. "I have been in touch with a therapist," he continued. "For both of us. Dr. Philip Merritt has an opening Thursday. I really think if we just sat down together, with someone qualified, you would feel so much better," Catherine said. "I want to leave." Garrett, a long pause. Long enough that the refrigerator hum became audible. Garrett said, very quietly, "You are not taking my child anywhere." He did not grab her. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood up from the table and positioned himself between Catherine and the front door. Not threatening, just present, an obstacle shaped like concern. Here is what no one tells you about coercive control. It does not look like screaming. It looks like worry. It sounds like love. And it works because we have been trained to distrust our own anger and trust other people's calmness. A woman who raises her voice is hysterical. A man who speaks softly is reasonable. Catherine had known this intellectually for years. She had never felt it so precisely until that moment. She backed down. She told herself she needed more time, more evidence, a better plan. She went to bed and Garrett kissed her forehead and turned off the light and lay beside her, breathing slowly in the dark. And Catherine stared at the ceiling and thought about Barbara Foss and the family court system and what her options actually were. The next morning, she went to the gas station 4 blocks from their house and her credit card was declined. She tried the other one, declined. She called the bank from a payphone, one of the last working payphones in Westchester County, and was told that the joint accounts had been flagged and were under a temporary hold pending a review. Her cell service showed When she borrowed the gas station attendant's phone to check, account suspended in less than 12 hours. While she slept 3 feet away from him, Garrett Brennan had made his wife financially invisible. He had done it legally. He had done it quietly. He had done it with paperwork and a phone call and the particular confidence of a man who has already spoken to very good attorneys. Catherine stood at that gas station with $31 in her wallet, 8 months of pregnancy, no working phone, and a husband who had just demonstrated, without raising his voice or laying a hand on her, exactly who he was. She drove home, smiled at Garrett over breakfast, said the accounts must have had a glitch. She would sort it out. He nodded sympathetically and offered to call the bank on her behalf. She said that would be so helpful. Thank you. And underneath the smile, the woman who had launched campaigns in 32 markets began to think very carefully about her next move. That same week, a woman named Monica Briggs arrived at the house. Private nurse, mid-50s. Efficient, Dr. Marsh had insisted, Garrett explained. Given the stress-related false labor risk, Monica had excellent references. She moved into the guest room and began keeping a clipboard she always angled away from Catherine's line of sight. Garrett also started working from home. To help, he said, to be there if she needed anything. What this meant in practice was that Catherine was never alone. Monica in the guest room, Garrett in his study. The house that had felt like a home began to feel like a facility. Every morning, Garrett brought her medication with breakfast, anti-anxiety medication prescribed by Dr. Philip Merritt, whom Catherine had never met. Just something mild, Garrett said, for the anxiety, for the baby. Catherine took the pills from him with her right hand and a glass of water in her left and said thank you and went to the bathroom and flushed them and rinsed her mouth and came back to the kitchen and smiled. She needed to be clear. Whatever came next, she needed every cell of her brain functioning at full capacity. The days had a suffocating sameness. Morning medication she did not take. Monica's meals and observations. Garrett's gentle, constant surveillance dressed up as devotion. Occasional visits from her sister Meg Patterson, who drove up from the city every few days. On the third visit, Catherine told Meg everything, sat her down at the kitchen table and laid it out plainly. The texts, the hotel charges, the ring receipt, the frozen accounts. Meg listened with her hands folded in her lap. When Catherine finished, Meg said, "Cat, honey, you are 8 months pregnant. Are you sure you are not reading into things? Garrett called me last week. He is so worried about you. He said you have been having panic attacks, that you have been seeing things that are not." Catherine said. "Meg, I saw the messages," Meg said. "I know you believe that, but pregnancy does things." Cat, remember how bad the anxiety was in the second trimester. Remember how you convinced yourself the basement was flooding when it was just the washing machine. Catherine looked at her sister for a long moment. The person who had held her hand at their mother's funeral. The person who had driven 4 hours to be in the room when they scattered the ashes. Already convinced. Already recruited. Though Meg would not have called it that. She would have called it concern. This is the moment where women in these situations most often stop fighting. Not when the man betrays them. When the people they love choose to believe him instead. Catherine reached across the table and squeezed Meg's hand and said, "You are probably right. I am probably just tired." And underneath that, quiet as a held breath, she made a decision. She was not going to win this by telling the truth to people who were already being told a different truth. She was going to need proof that no one could reframe, and she was going to get it alone. 3 weeks into what Garrett called her recovery, Catherine attempted to reach her former employer. Richard Cole had left the company 2 years earlier to start his own marketing firm. He and Catherine had stayed in touch. He had told her, at the firm's first anniversary dinner, that when she was ready to come back to work, he would create a position for her. He had meant it. She had believed him. She borrowed Monica's cell phone under the pretense of calling her sister. Standing at the kitchen window where Garrett could see her through the glass and would see nothing alarming. Richard picked up on the second ring. He said, "Cat, I heard you had been going through some things." She said, "I wanted to talk about coming back after the baby. Actually, Sloan Whitfield reached out to me a few weeks ago. She was concerned about you," said Garrett was beside himself, "that there had been some episodes." He paused. "Maybe focus on getting better first, and then we can revisit this."
Okay.
Catherine said, "Of course, thank you, Richard." She handed the phone back to Monica and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bathtub with her hands on her belly and understood what had just happened. Sloan had gotten there first. Not just at the hospital, not just with Meg, with everyone. She had constructed a professional Catherine, a social Catherine, a familial Catherine who was fragile and irrational and not to be trusted with sharp objects or major decisions. She had been building this version of Catherine for months, carefully, the way you build something meant to last. The baby kicked, hard, as if registering a complaint. Catherine said quietly to her belly, I know, give me time. In a family court, that conversation with Richard Cole would have been documented as evidence of Catherine's deteriorating professional relationships. Monica would have noted that Catherine borrowed her phone and seemed agitated afterward. Dr. Philip Merritt would have added it to the file he was building under Garrett's direction. There is a name for what was happening to Catherine. Coercive control. It is recognized as domestic abuse in all 50 states. You do not have to be struck to qualify for a protective order. Financial isolation. Monitoring communications. Controlling medication. Systematically destroying someone's credibility. These are legally documented forms of abuse. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. They have a chat option if calling is not safe. You do not have to be in immediate danger to reach out. You just have to feel like something is wrong. That has always been enough. Catherine did not have access to that hotline, but she had something Garrett had not thought to take away from her. She had her memory, and she had 11 years of training in how to outthink people who underestimated her. The company's annual gala was 3 weeks away. Catherine had been a primary planner before her maternity leave. She had chosen the venue. She had approved the catering. She had spent 2 months on the guest list. Garrett said he did not think she should go. Catherine said she had been confined to this house for weeks and she was going. He could not refuse. Not without causing a scene. Not in front of the investors who would be watching to see how devoted he was to his visibly pregnant wife. She spent the afternoon before the gala doing something she had not done in over a month. She got dressed intentionally. She chose the black maternity dress she had been saving. She did her hair and her makeup carefully, not quickly, with the attention of someone who is preparing for something important rather than just a party. In the elevator of the Alderton Hotel, riding up to the rooftop terrace, she caught her reflection in the mirrored doors and made herself a promise. By the end of tonight, she would have something she could use. The terrace was spectacular. City lights below, October air above, and 100 people who represented everything her life had been before she had traded it in for a nursery, and a husband who brought her flowers and watched her constantly. She moved through the room the way she used to move through rooms, with the particular ease of someone who knows her own value. Marcus Webb, a longtime client, found her near the bar, he said. Kat, you look absolutely radiant. She laughed, genuinely. For a few minutes she forgot. Then Diane Holloway appeared at her elbow. Diane, the head of HR, a woman Catherine had hired 3 years ago. Diane glanced around and lowered her voice to something below the ambient noise of the party and said, he is restructuring the whole department. Everyone who was loyal to you is getting cut. Sloan is running everything now. And I have seen emails. Kat. He has been consulting a family attorney for months. Catherine absorbed this, stored it, thanked her quietly. She looked across the terrace and found Garrett in conversation with a group of investors. Sloan stood 15 feet away, in a red dress, talking to someone else entirely. They had barely acknowledged each other all evening. Too careful, too rehearsed. For exactly 47 minutes. Catherine felt like she might actually be okay. She was in a room full of people. She had an ally. She had information. She had a plan beginning to take shape. She felt safe. She was not safe. Sloan found Catherine near the outer edge of the terrace, in a section screened from the main party by decorative planters and a string of lights that made everything look warmer and more private than it was. Sloan said, I thought we should talk. Woman to woman, Catherine said. I do not think we have anything to say to each other, Sloan said. Garrett and I are having a baby, 2 months along. I wanted you to hear it from me. The city spread out below them, 30 floors down, 1,000 points of light. Catherine could hear the party behind the planters, laughter and music and the clink of glasses, entirely unaware. She said, you need to walk away from me right now, Sloan said, almost lazily. Or what? Catherine. What came next took less than 3 seconds. Sloan's hands on Catherine's shoulders. Not a shove, not a dramatic push. The kind of firm, deliberate pressure that looks from a distance like someone reaching out to help. Catherine's center of gravity was already shifted by 33 weeks of pregnancy, her balance instinctively unreliable near edges. The railing caught her at the back of her knees, and then the city lights were spinning, and the air was rushing, and Catherine was falling. She hit the decorative hedge garden 3 stories below. Branches tore at her dress and her arms. The impact drove the breath out of her completely. She lay on her back in the broken hedges, and the first coherent thought she had was not about pain, which was everywhere, or fear, which was enormous. It was about Emily. She pressed one hand to her belly and waited and felt. After 2 seconds that lasted approximately forever, the baby move. Alive, both of them. Above her, Sloane's voice was already carrying down, perfectly calibrated with shock and distress. Help. Someone help. She fell. She was confused. She was standing too close. I tried to grab her, running footsteps. Voices. Garrett's voice. First among them. Breaking with exactly the right amount of panic. Catherine tried to speak. What came out was a breath. She lay there in the wreckage of the hedges and watched Sloane accept comfort from the guests gathering at the railing above, and understood with the cold clarity of someone who has had 3 seconds to think about nothing else that this had been planned. Not necessarily tonight, not necessarily this specific moment, but this outcome, this possibility. It had been somewhere in the plan. The paramedics arrived. They checked her vitals, checked Emily's heartbeat, stabilized her neck. The whole time Catherine kept trying to speak and kept being gently told to stay still. Stay calm. Do not exert yourself. When they loaded her onto the stretcher, she saw Garrett's face above her, wet with tears, the picture of a terrified husband. She looked at him and she thought of what she had overheard weeks ago after tonight. She will not be a problem anymore, and she understood that his tears were real. He was genuinely upset. Not because she was hurt, because she had not finished falling. The emergency room was noise and light and the particular organized chaos of a trauma bay on a Friday night. Emily's heartbeat on the monitor, 142 beats per minute. Strong, steady. Her little percussion against the crisis. Catherine had bruised ribs, lacerations on both forearms, a concussion classified as mild. The attending physician said twice that it was miraculous. Garrett held her hand throughout and did not let go. The nurses brought him coffee. He thanked them warmly. He was, as he had always been in public, impeccable, doctor. Marsh arrived within the hour. She examined Catherine's chart, spoke quietly with the attending, and came to the bedside with the expression of a doctor who is choosing words with unusual care. She said, "Catherine, the incident report says you were alone by the railing when you went over. Is there anything about that account that you want to correct?" Catherine said, "She pushed me. Sloane pushed me. She told me she was pregnant with Garrett's child, and then she pushed me over that railing." The silence in the room landed differently depending on who you were, Garrett said, quietly, gently. She was disoriented all evening. She has been having episodes at home. "Sandra, I told you about the paranoid thinking." Catherine removed his hand from her arm, slowly, deliberately, in front of everyone in that room. First time she had done it in front of another person. Dr. Marsh looked between them. There is a particular kind of horror in telling the truth and watching every face in the room decide you are lying. Not because your story does not add up, but because someone else got there first, Catherine said. "Sandra, I need to speak with you privately," Garrett said. "Of course." Stepped out graciously. Said he would get coffee. Take his time. When the door closed behind him, Catherine leaned forward in the hospital bed and said, "You have been my doctor for 4 years. I need you to listen to me as your patient, not as Garrett's wife. He is having an affair. His assistant pushed me off that terrace. This is not paranoia, and it is not the concussion, and it is not pregnancy hormones. It is real, and I have documentation, and I need you to help me, doctor." Marsh was quiet for a long time. She sat down. She looked at her hands. She said, "Catherine." The witnesses at the scene were consistent. Miss Whitfield was on the other side of the terrace. Multiple people placed her there. I am not saying you are lying. I am saying your memory of the event may have been affected by the trauma and the fall." And Catherine said, "She was not on the other side of the terrace, doctor." Marsh said, "I think you should see Dr. Merritt. I think it would help you process this." Even her doctor chose him. Catherine lay back against the pillow, stared at the ceiling, and understood something that would take her months to fully articulate. She was not going to be rescued. No one was coming. If she was going to survive this, she was going to have to do it while concussed, while 9 months pregnant, while the man who had orchestrated her fall fluffed her hospital pillow and told the nurses she was his whole world. That night, after Garrett had gone to speak with a doctor in the hallway, Catherine lay in the dark room with the machines beeping their steady reassurance and made herself an inventory of everything she had and everything she did not have. It took 11 minutes, and it was not a comforting list. But at the bottom of it, she added one item: the old phone in the diaper bag, the prepaid plan, the photographs of Garrett's documents, and the admin credentials for a cloud backup system she had personally installed 2 years ago that no one had thought to revoke. Not nothing, not yet. They brought Catherine home 4 days later. Garrett carried her bag. Monica was waiting at the door. The nursery was ready. The room they had painted sea glass together. The crib assembled over that long weekend argument that now felt like a memory from someone else's life. The first night home, lying in the bedroom that no longer felt like hers. Catherine heard Garrett on the phone in his study down the hall. She caught fragments through the wall. Evaluation is scheduled. Merritt is on board. Custody filing within the month. She had known this was coming. Hearing the timeline said aloud was different. She pressed her hand to her belly and made Emily a promise she had no current plan to keep. The days settled into a pattern that looked from the outside like recovery. Monica managed Catherine's medications and meals and sleep schedule. Garrett worked from home and appeared periodically with tea or a book or the gentle suggestion that she rest. Dr. Philip Merritt came to the house twice a week for what he called supportive sessions and what were. Catherine understood. Evaluations being added to a file. Merritt was not a bad man. This was actually worse. He was a careful man, a thorough man, who had been given a complete and entirely false history of his patient by her husband and was treating accordingly. He asked her, in various configurations, whether she sometimes felt that people around her were working against her, whether she had difficulty distinguishing fear from reality, whether she trusted her own perceptions. Catherine answered every question with the careful neutrality of someone who knows they are being tested. She said she was working on her anxiety. She said Garrett had been so supportive. She said Dr. Merritt's guidance was really helping her feel more grounded. He wrote things in his folder and seemed pleased with her progress. At night, after Garrett had said his quiet goodnight and Monica's room down the hall had gone dark, Catherine would slip the old phone out of the diaper bag and read what Barbara Foss had replied to her emails. Barbara was building a response to whatever Garrett filed. She needed more documentation. She needed the source of the psychiatric evaluation. She needed anything that showed coordination between Garrett and Sloan prior to Catherine's discovery of the affair. Catherine was working on that. 3 weeks after the fall, a visitor came to the house who had not been invited by Garrett. Detective Frank Aldridge, mid-50s, worn blazer, the kind of face that has heard enough stories to make it difficult to surprise. Monica showed him into the living room. Garrett was at the office. For the first time in weeks, Catherine was alone with someone who was not monitoring her on her husband's behalf. Aldridge said he was following up on the incident at the Alderton, said there had been some questions raised about the circumstances. Catherine felt the first real surge of hope she had experienced since the fall. Then Aldridge said, "I understand you initially indicated you were pushed, but the medical evaluation suggests you later reconsidered that account," Catherine said. Carefully, "I was confused after the fall. The concussion, the medication." Aldridge made a note, said, "So you are saying now that you fell accidentally?" Catherine looked at him for a moment. She thought about what she knew and what she could prove and the difference between the two. She said, "I was standing too close to the railing. I lost my balance." Aldridge studied her the way experienced detectives study people who are not saying everything they mean. He reached into his inside pocket and produced a business card. He said, "Mrs. Brennan, if you ever remember anything else about that night, anything at all, please call me. Sometimes memories become clearer with time." After he left, Catherine held the card for a long moment before sliding it into the hidden pocket of the diaper bag. Someone was asking questions. Someone was not entirely satisfied with the official account. It was not enough. But it was something. That same evening, Garrett came home from the office and said, his voice very controlled, "I heard we had a visitor today." Catherine said, "A detective, following up on the accident. I told him the same thing I told everyone, that I fell." Garrett studied her face with the attention of someone looking for a crack. He said, "I want to make sure we are presenting a united front. Any suggestion that this was anything other than an accident would raise questions about your state of mind. Questions that could be very damaging at a difficult time." Catherine said, "Of course, I understand completely." She smiled at him over dinner and passed him the salad and talked about what Emily's room needed still. A bookshelf, maybe, and whether the mobile was appropriate for newborns or only for older babies. And inside the smile, very quiet, very precise, she was counting the days. Emily Brennan arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, 7 pounds and 4 ounces of perfect screaming humanity. At 6:42 in the morning, when the first light was coming through the hospital blinds, Catherine held her daughter and stopped the entire world for a moment. Not the investigation, not the documentation, not the plan she was building in the dark with a prepaid phone and stolen minutes. All of it stopped. Just Emily. Just this person she had built inside her own body and was now holding in her arms for the first time. Emily smelled like something Catherine did not have a word for. New, clean, entirely hers. For 24 hours, she was only a mother. she thought, watching Emily sleep against her chest. Maybe this changes things. Maybe a daughter changes him. Maybe this is where the nightmare ends. It was not where the nightmare ended. 36 hours after Emily's birth, Garrett arrived at the hospital room with Dr. Philip Merritt. Merritt said it was a routine evaluation, given everything. Said Dr. Marsh had agreed it was the responsible choice. His voice was kind. His clipboard was ready. The questions were the same questions, arranged in a new order. Do you feel that people around you are working against you? Have you had thoughts that seem disproportionate to their cause? Do you feel in control of your emotions? 2 hours later, the result was delivered gently, the way all terrible things were delivered in this particular operation. Postpartum psychosis risk. Recommended supervised contact with infant until further evaluation could be completed. Supervised contact with Emily, Catherine's own daughter, who was currently sleeping in a hospital bassinet 3 feet away. She did not argue. She nodded and thanked Dr. Merritt for his time and asked the nurse if Emily could stay in the room with her overnight, and was told that Monica would be coming in to assist with the transition home. She held Emily while Monica was out of the room and said quietly into the top of her daughter's head, I know. Just give me a little more time. 3 days after coming home, at 3 in the morning while Emily slept and Monica's room was dark and silent, Catherine padded down the hallway in socks and found the door to Garrett's study standing slightly open. Just slightly, enough that the latch had not caught. She stood in the hallway for a full minute. Then she went in, second drawer of the desk, a manila folder with her name typed neatly on the tab. Inside, Monica's daily reports. Photographs, taken without Catherine's knowledge, of her crying at the kitchen table. Fabricated therapy notes attributed to sessions that had never occurred. And at the back of the folder, a legal document. The header read, Emergency Custody Motion, Grounds Postpartum Psychosis, History of Emotional Instability, Imminent Risk to Minor Child. Filing date, 4 days from now. She photographed every page with the old phone, put the folder back exactly as she had found it, walked back to the nursery and picked Emily up and held her in the dark until Emily fell back asleep. She had 4 days. No working credit cards, no cell service, a body still recovering from labor, a husband who had outplanned her at every single turn. And then, at 2 in the morning of the next night, she found the thing that changed everything. It started with a detail she had been turning over for weeks. Garrett had frozen the accounts, had cut the phone, had moved so quickly and so completely on the night of their confrontation that it felt prepared, rehearsed, too fast for improvisation. She opened the old phone and connected to the neighbor's Wi-Fi, a network whose password she knew because the neighbor had given it to her 3 years ago for exactly this kind of situation. And she logged into the company's cloud backup system using the admin credentials she had set up personally 2 years before. Credentials no one had thought to revoke, because no one had imagined she would remember having them. She pulled 3 months of internal emails. What she found rewrote everything. Emails between Sloan Whitfield and Garrett's personal attorney, timestamped 6 months before Catherine had ever found those text messages on the forgotten phone, before the false labor scare, before Monica was hired, before the psychiatric referrals. Planning language, timeline language, language about Catherine's stability and the company's future and custody arrangements that would be seamless given the documented history of emotional episodes. 6 months before Catherine discovered the affair, someone had already written the ending of her story. She was never the problem in their marriage. She was the target, and now she had the emails. She sat in the nursery with Emily against her chest and the phone in her hand and thought about Detective Aldridge's business card at the bottom of the diaper bag. She thought about Barbara Foss and what Barbara had said. We need coordination evidence. We need something that shows this was planned before you discovered it. That changes the entire legal argument. She had it. She forwarded the emails to Barbara's private address and wrote 2 words. Found it. The custody motion was filed. Catherine and Barbara Foss filed their counter motion on the same day, citing financial abuse, manufactured psychiatric history, and the coordinated plan evidenced by the cloud emails. The judge stayed the original motion pending review. For 72 hours, Catherine allowed herself to breathe. She gave Emily a bath and marveled at her daughter's absolute confidence in the water, the way she had apparently entered the world with opinions about temperature and depth. She ordered pizza, extra cheese, something she had not done in months because Garrett had suggestions about her diet. She sat in the rocking chair in the nursery after Emily was asleep and called Meg and talked for an hour about nothing that mattered. She thought, this is where it turns. I have the emails. I have Barbara. I have the counter motion. Garrett overplayed his hand and I have proof of it. This is where it turns. She was wrong. But she did not know that yet. The next morning, Detective Aldridge called. He had been doing what Catherine had hoped he would do after she slipped him the name of the private security firm in a carefully worded note she had sent through Barbara's office. The private firm that had managed the rooftop event security had their own footage, separate from the hotel, retained for 90 days for liability purposes. Aldridge said, "Mrs. Brennan, I owe you an apology." His voice was different, stripped of its professional neutrality. Something underneath it that might have been embarrassment. The footage is not a clean angle, but it shows the contact. Her hands on your shoulders, moving forward. Garrett and Sloan were arrested within 24 hours. The custody motion was not just stayed, it was withdrawn. Barbara Foss filed a motion citing malicious fabrication of psychiatric evidence. Monica Briggs, who turned out to have a much more complicated relationship with what she had been asked to do in the Brennan house than she had initially admitted, cooperated fully with the investigation in exchange for an immunity agreement she had apparently been negotiating quietly for 3 weeks. Catherine sat in Barbara's office with Emily asleep in the carrier against her chest and felt something she had almost forgotten: the texture of safety, the possibility of a future that looked like something she had chosen. She had one more evening of it. Meg called the following morning. Her voice was the wrong kind of careful. She said, "Cat, I was served papers this morning as a witness in the custody motion." Catherine said, "That motion was withdrawn." Meg said, "Not entirely. His attorney filed an amendment. They are still pursuing reduced visitation rights pending the criminal investigation. And Cat, they have my statement about Thanksgiving 2 years ago." "About the panic attack," Catherine said, very quietly. "That was an allergic reaction." "Meg, you drove me to urgent care," Meg said. "I know." But the way it was described in the deposition, Catherine hung up the phone. Richard Cole's office called 20 minutes later. His assistant said Mr. Cole wanted Catherine to know that given the current circumstances, he would not be able to extend the offer they had discussed. He wished her well. Then Barbara Foss called. Her voice had the particular controlled calm of someone delivering information they wish they were not delivering. She said, "The family court evaluator reviewed Dr. Merritt's notes. Even with the counter motion in play, there is a temporary supervision recommendation while the criminal case is active. Catherine, it does not mean you lose Emily. It means you have supervised visitation until the trial concludes." Catherine sat in the nursery with Emily in her arms and counted what remained. No income. Accounts still frozen pending legal proceedings. Cell service restored only because Barbara had filed an emergency motion. No professional reputation. Her OB had stepped back from the case citing conflict. Her HR ally had turned out to be a spy. Her sister was a witness for the other side. Her former employer had withdrawn. The detective believed her, but the legal machinery moved slowly. And in 48 hours, a family court supervisor would be installed in her home to monitor her interactions with her own daughter. She had been methodically dismantled, not with violence, not with cruelty, with paperwork and phone calls and the quiet, sustained architecture of institutional disbelief. Here is what attorneys and advocates say about situations like Catherine's. Financial abuse is the #1 reason women stay in dangerous situations. Not love, not fear of physical harm. Money, the specific. Terrifying helplessness of having no financial identity of your own. If you are in a relationship where your partner controls all finances, there are concrete steps available to you right now. Open a personal bank account at a different institution, even with $20. It establishes legal financial identity. Keep physical copies of important documents somewhere outside your home. Know that all marital assets are subject to equitable distribution. And know that most family law attorneys offer a free 30-minute initial consultation. You do not need money to start. You need one phone call. Catherine had made that phone call 8 months ago, when she had $31 at a gas station and an old phone in a diaper bag. She had built everything that came next on that one phone call. She picked up Emily and held her close and said, very quietly, against her daughter's soft hair, "I am not done. We are not done. Do you understand me? We are not done." Emily made a small sound that Catherine chose to interpret as agreement. 3 in the morning. Emily asleep in her bassinet. The house quiet in a way that felt almost like permission. Catherine sat at the kitchen table with the old phone, a legal pad, and a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. She had been in corporate strategy for 11 years. She had turned around failing brands in 6 months. She had sat across from attorneys twice her age in rooms designed to intimidate, and she had won arguments she had been told she could not win. She had spent 8 months letting everyone around her convince her that woman no longer existed. She had been wrong to believe them. She wrote a list, not of what she had lost, of what she still had. The cloud emails, already in Barbara's possession. The photographs of the folder documents. Aldridge and the security footage. Merritt, who had been unwittingly complicit and who might, if approached correctly, become a witness rather than an obstacle. And one more thing. The name of the private security firm had come to her from a detail in the event planning documents she had drafted 8 months ago, when she was still VP of Marketing and still responsible for the gala. She had hired that firm herself. She still had the contract in her email archive. She also had something Garrett had not considered. He had removed her from the company's active employee roster when she went on maternity leave. He had suspended her network access and her corporate email. What he had not done, because it had not occurred to him, was remove her admin credentials from the cloud backup system she had built and installed personally during a technology overhaul 2 years earlier. Because he had forgotten, or because he had never really believed she understood the infrastructure of her own work. That was his version of underestimating her, and it had cost him everything. Barbara Foss, when she received Catherine's email at 6 in the morning, called within 20 minutes. She said, "This is enough. This is more than enough." The emails predate the affair discovery by 6 months. That changes the entire legal argument from domestic dispute to coordinated financial and emotional abuse campaign. I can file a motion this week that essentially flips the fitness argument. Instead of you defending your mental stability, we put Garrett on the stand explaining why he was planning a custody removal before his wife even knew there was an affair. Catherine said. "What do we need?" Barbara said. "We need an expert witness on coercive control. I have 2 colleagues who specialize, and we need Merritt. I think if we approach him with the full picture, the manufacturing of the psychiatric history, the fabricated notes, he will cooperate. He does not want his name on this case if the alternative is being called as a defense witness," Catherine said. "Let me talk to him." Dr. Philip Merritt arrived at Barbara's office 2 days later, looking like a man who had not slept well since the arrest. He sat across the table from Catherine and said, before anyone else could speak, "I had no idea." Catherine said, "I know," he said. "The information I was given about your history, the reports, the documentation of episodes, the prior psychiatric evaluations, all of it was fabricated." Catherine said, "Yes," he said. "I want to help. Whatever you need." He became the most damaging witness Garrett's defense team faced at trial. A psychiatrist describing in precise clinical language how a coordinated campaign of false information had been used to manipulate the mental health system against a patient. There was no technical language for the jury to get lost in. It was simply, as Merritt described it, one of the most sophisticated cases of institutional weaponization he had encountered in 30 years of practice. Meanwhile, Aldridge was working through his own channel. The security footage, once submitted to the prosecutor's office, was enough to arrest Sloan on 1 count of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, the railing. The height and the known pregnancy of the victim made the charge viable. Garrett was charged with conspiracy, financial abuse, and a third charge Catherine had not expected. The emails, particularly one time-stamped 4 months before the gala, contained a line that the prosecutor described as evidence of intent. The line read, "If the fall does not resolve matters, we have the psychiatric route as a backup." Catherine sat in the prosecutor's office when the charge sheet was read aloud and felt something she had not felt in almost a year. A proper, clean, uncomplicated anger. Not fear, not grief, anger. The kind that has a direction. She said, "What does the timeline look like?" The prosecutor said, "If the evidence holds, and I believe it will, we are looking at a trial date 6 months out. Conviction on the conspiracy charge alone carries 8 to 12 years. With the financial abuse enhancement and the assault charge against Ms. Whitfield, we are looking at significantly more. 6 months. She could do 6 months. She had done 8 months already. She could do 6 more. The trial lasted 4 weeks. Catherine testified for 2 days. The prosecutor had prepared her carefully, walking her through the timeline with a precision that made the jury understand not just what had happened, but the sequence of it. How the plan had preceded the discovery. How the psychiatric history had been manufactured. How the financial isolation had been engineered. How the push off the terrace had been intended as a solution to a problem that the plan had created. She sat in the witness box and answered every question in the same voice she had used in 100 board presentations. Clear, specific, without excess emotion. Because she had learned that a woman's emotion in a courtroom is treated as evidence of instability, while a man's emotion is treated as evidence of sincerity. She was asked by the defense attorney whether she had a history of anxiety. She said, "I was prescribed medication for anxiety by a psychiatrist who has since testified that the prescription was based on fabricated information." The answer to your question depends on which history you are referring to. The real one, or the one my husband built. The jury was out for 11 hours. Guilty on all counts for Garrett Brennan. Conspiracy, financial abuse, coercion, attempted murder. For the email evidence combined with the fall, 19 years. No early release consideration for 5. Guilty on assault and conspiracy for Sloan Whitfield. Life in prison. Parole eligibility review not until 2043. Catherine sat in the gallery and held Meg's hand and watched the verdict come in and felt, for one whole second, like it was over. It was not over. She took Emily home to her new apartment that evening, a 2-bedroom in a building with a doorman and a good deadbolt, and a view of a park where she planned to take Emily on weekends. She had found it through Barbara's office, had paid the security deposit with money from an emergency fund Barbara had helped her establish through a process Catherine had not known existed. A legal provision allowing access to marital assets when one party has engaged in financial abuse. She ordered Chinese food. She gave Emily a bath. She put Emily to bed and sat in the quiet of her own living room, genuinely her own, with a glass of wine she actually wanted, and thought about what came next. She had a job offer from a boutique marketing firm whose founder had read about the case in the Times. She had a call scheduled with Barbara about the finalization of the divorce proceedings. She had a session booked with Dr. Daniel Hartley, a trauma therapist Barbara had recommended who reportedly had excellent results with people who had spent extended periods in coercive control situations. She had a daughter asleep in the next room. The phone rang at 9:47. Unknown number. She almost did not answer. Then she thought about how many times in the last year not answering had been the wrong choice. She picked up. A voice she recognized said, "Hello, Catherine." It took her 3 full seconds to place it. The efficient clip of it. The professional warmth. Brooke, her assistant, who had started 6 weeks ago when Catherine had been trying to pull herself back together enough to do some consulting work. Brooke Caldwell, 26, meticulous, excellent references. But the voice was different now. The professional warmth was gone. What remained was flat and precise, the voice said. "My real name is Brooke Whitfield. Sloan is my sister, and I have Emily." Catherine walked very quietly to Emily's room and opened the door and looked at the empty crib and the window that was open 3 inches wider than she had left it, and the absence of her daughter, who had been asleep there 20 minutes ago. She said, into the phone, with the voice of someone who is choosing not to be afraid because fear is not useful right now. "Where is she?" Brooke said. "She is safe. For now." "That depends on you," Catherine said. "What do you want?" Brooke said. "I want you to come to the place where this all started. The rooftop of the Alderton Hotel. Come alone and come now. If you bring police, if you try to be clever, Emily pays for it." The line went dead. Catherine stood in the empty nursery for exactly 30 seconds. Then she picked up the old phone and called Frank Aldridge. She said, "Brooke Caldwell, my former assistant. I need you to run the name against Sloan Whitfield, and I need a trace on her cell signal, and I need it in the next 10 minutes, Aldridge said. "Catherine," she said, "she has Emily. I am going to the Alderton rooftop. I will keep my phone on. I need you there in 20 minutes or less. Can you do that?" A pause. Then, "Do not go up without confirmation we are in position." She said, "I will go up when I go up." "Be there," she called Meg from the cab. Said, "I need you to trust me one more time. One more time." "Meg, can you do that?" Meg said yes before Catherine had finished the sentence. She called Barbara. She called Daniel Hartley, who was not yet her therapist but who had given her his emergency line and whose voice was steady when she told him what was happening and who said, "I will meet you there. Tell me where." 12 phone calls in 11 minutes. Because she had learned, over the past 10 months, the most important thing that coercive control tries to prevent you from learning. The answer to isolation is not self-sufficiency. It is connection. It is building a network of people who know what you know and can act when you cannot. She had been isolated. She had been dismantled. And she had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, connection by connection, until the person who had tried to make her disappear would find, when she arrived at that rooftop, not a woman alone. A woman with 12 people who knew exactly where she was. The Alderton Hotel rooftop was quiet at 11 in the evening. The decorative planters were still there. The string lights still wound through the railings. October again. Almost exactly a year since Catherine had fallen from this height. Brooke stood near the center of the terrace with Emily in her arms. Emily was awake, wide-eyed, regarding the lights of the city with the philosophical calm of a child who has not yet been taught to be afraid of heights. She saw Catherine come through the stairwell door and reached both arms out. Catherine did not run. She walked, steadily, stopped 12 feet away. She said, "Brooke, I know who you are. I know why you are here. And I know that you are not your sister," Brooke said. She is dead because of you, Catherine said. She is dead because of choices she made long before she met me. I have read the files. I know about the women in other states. I know about the executive in Chicago and the woman in Atlanta and what happened to them. Your sister was a predator, Brooke. I am sorry she was the only family you had. I am genuinely sorry for that. But I am not responsible for what she chose to do. Brooke's arms tightened slightly around Emily. Emily made a sound of protest and reached again toward Catherine. Catherine said, "She knows where her mother is. She is going to keep reaching until you give her back." Something moved across Brooke's face. Not a decision. Exactly. More like the exhaustion of someone who has been holding a position they never fully believed in. She said, "She told me you destroyed her." Catherine said, "I survived her." There is a difference, and I think some part of you knows that. Aldridge's team was in the stairwells. Catherine knew this. Brooke did not yet know this. Brooke said, "What happens to me?" Catherine said, "That is not up to me. But I can tell you that cooperating fully is the difference between 20 years and 10. And I can tell you that Emily is going to grow up knowing what happened to her mother. And I would rather that story include a person who chose, at the last moment, to do the right thing." A long silence. The city humming 30 floors below. Then Brooke walked toward Catherine and held Emily out. Emily grabbed Catherine's collar with both hands and held on with the grip of someone who has decided this person is where she belongs. Catherine held her daughter and said, over Emily's head, to Brooke, "Step back from the railing. Put your hands where they can see them." Aldridge's team came through the stairwell door. Brooke sat down on the rooftop concrete and put her face in her hands and cried, the kind of crying that has been waiting for a long time, and did not resist when they cuffed her. Catherine stood with Emily against her chest and breathed the October air and looked at the city spread out below them. The same city that had been spinning around her when she fell from this same height a year ago, and felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. Not relief, not triumph, just presence, just here. And Emily here, and the future open rather than closed. In the months that followed, the pieces resolved the way real things resolve. Not cleanly, not all at once, but gradually, with paperwork and phone calls and a great deal of sitting in rooms with professionals discussing what had happened and what came next. Brooke Whitfield pleaded guilty in exchange for full cooperation with the prosecution. Her testimony closed several questions the original trial had left open and added 2 additional charges against Garrett that extended his sentence by 3 years. She was sentenced to 7 years with parole eligibility at 4. She served them. Dr. Philip Merritt submitted a formal complaint to the state medical board and worked personally with a committee examining how psychiatric evaluation processes could be manipulated in custody disputes. New guidelines were issued 18 months later. He became something of an advocate, which Catherine found simultaneously ironic and appropriate. Diane Holloway's cooperation had been extracted under coercion. Garrett had documentation that threatened her own family's financial stability, and the prosecutor's office agreed that her culpability was limited. She testified. She was given immunity. She later gave a statement to a congressional subcommittee examining coercive control in workplace settings. Catherine watched it on a live stream from her office and thought, everyone is trying to make something useful out of what happened to them. Maybe that was the only real way through. Catherine started her own firm, she and a partner from Barbara Foss's network, a woman who had spent 15 years in crisis communications and had her own complicated history with institutional systems. Built it from scratch in a rented office the size of a generous closet. By the second year, they had moved twice and were in the process of moving again. Catherine named it simply. Her initials, the year, not a monument, just hers. She wrote a book, largely because Barbara told her the royalties would fund Emily's college education. And that was not a conversation Catherine was going to lose. The book was called I Was Not Crazy. I was right. It sold well, better than well. It went to number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list the first week, and to number 1 the second, and stayed in the top 10 for 4 months. Catherine found this funnier than most people expected her to. Garrett had spent 18 months convincing everyone she was unstable, and she had used that story to build the most stable thing she had ever made. She also started a resource center, not a foundation, not a nonprofit, but a working organization staffed by people who had direct experience with coercive control in family court proceedings. It operated in 9 states. It helped women navigate the specific, nightmarish intersection of psychological abuse and legal systems that were not designed to understand it. Catherine showed up there every 3rd Thursday to talk to whoever needed to talk. She met Dr. Daniel Hartley properly, as a therapist, 6 weeks after the Alderton rooftop. He was good at his work, in the way that the best practitioners are good at their work. by being genuinely interested in the person in front of them rather than the case they represent. He did not tell Catherine what to feel about anything. He asked good questions and then listened to the answers. After 8 months, he was no longer her therapist. After 14 months, he was something else. He made terrible coffee and extraordinary Sunday morning pancakes and had never once in their relationship suggested that Catherine's anger was disproportionate, or her caution was excessive, or her ambition was anything other than something to be actively supported. She thought sometimes that this was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. Emily turned 5 on a Saturday in October. She was obsessed with butterflies and absolutely convinced that her middle name, Rose, had been chosen because she was the prettiest flower. Catherine had, in fact, chosen it because her mother's middle name was Rose, and she had wanted a thread connecting Emily to a woman she would never meet. But she did not correct Emily's interpretation. Emily's interpretation was also accurate. At the birthday party, Meg stood in the kitchen of Catherine's apartment doing dishes with the easy familiarity of someone who knows where the dish soap is kept and does not need to be told. They talked about Emily, and about Meg's daughter who was starting kindergarten, and about a restaurant they both wanted to try, and about nothing that had happened in the past 5 years. Sometimes the way you move forward is just by moving, by putting one ordinary moment in front of another until the distance between you and the worst thing that ever happened to you is too great to see across. On a Tuesday morning in April, Catherine sat at her kitchen table with a coffee she had made herself and read a letter from a woman named Laura in Boise, Idaho. The letter said, "I did not think anyone would believe me. I thought I was losing my mind. I watched my husband take my daughter to school every morning and smile at the teachers, and I thought, everyone believes him. Everyone always believes him. And then I found your book, and I understood for the first time what was actually happening to me. I left 2 weeks ago. My daughter and I are at my sister's house. We are safe. I just wanted you to know. Thank you for not disappearing." Catherine read it twice, filed it with the others. She picked up her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the park, where a woman was pushing a stroller along the path below, and thought about what she would say to Laura if Laura were sitting across from her at this table. She would say, "You were not crazy. You were right." She would say, "Trust your own reality." When someone tries to make you doubt your perceptions, that is the signal. That is the thing that tells you that you are seeing something clearly that they very much need you not to see. She would say, "You do not have to be rescued. You have to be strategic. You have to document. You have to build your network before you need it. You have to understand that the same intelligence they told you was instability is the intelligence that is going to save you." She would say, "A mother's love is not a weakness. It is the most dangerous thing in the world to underestimate." And she would say this, "The person who tried to make you disappear was counting on something. They were counting on you believing the version of yourself they had constructed. The unstable one, the hysterical one, the woman who should be grateful for her supervision and her medication and her managed existence. Do not believe it, not for 1 second, not even on the days when the case against yourself is the loudest thing in the room. Because you are not the person they said you were. You are the person you have always been, and you are still here." Catherine set down the letter, picked up her coffee, looked out at the park. Emily was at school. Daniel was at his office. Meg was coming for dinner on Thursday. The Resource Center had a new intake coordinator starting Monday. The second book was 50 pages from a first draft. Ordinary Tuesday. Ordinary April. The kind of morning that becomes the fabric of a life you have actually chosen. She had been pushed off a rooftop. She had been gaslit by the man who shared her bed. She had been isolated from her money, her reputation, her family, her sense of reality. She had given birth alone in a hospital room where the nurse worked for her husband. She had fought a custody battle for a child who was still inside her body when it started. She had survived all of it. Not because she was extraordinary, because she remembered, at the critical moment, that she was capable. That is the whole story. That is the only story that matters. The woman they tried to erase is sitting at her kitchen table in April, drinking coffee she made herself, in an apartment with her name on the lease, in a life she built from the wreckage of the one they destroyed. She is not grateful for what happened to her. She is clear about who she is because of it, and she is not going anywhere. If anything in this story sounded familiar, please know that support is available. The National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Chat options are available if calling is not safe. You do not have to be in immediate danger to reach out. You just have to feel like something is wrong. That has always been enough. Thank you for staying until the end.